It's being recorded now.
Thank you.
But you can find the event tomorrow if you've missed it, or want to refer back to the event at any time. It will be available on our website, posted by tomorrow morning, in our May event. Go ahead. While we're here, we wanted to let you know about our Texas Master Naturalist Be the Change series, which is another advanced training event we have. May 18th is our next event for that series, part of our TMN Tuesday series with Alex Bailey. And he is from the Black Outside organization, and he'll be talking about how we can connect with other organizations with a like mission. So he'll be giving us some tips on that. And our upcoming TMN Tuesdays, June 8th, come in June. We have June 8th, our TMN Tuesdays advanced training event. And then June 15th is our next Be the Change event. Just a little bit of webinar etiquette for you today. As a reminder, we've had a lot of attendees since we've covered this earlier this afternoon come on. We have a lot of attendees on today, so we have the chat box turned on for you. You can ask your questions there, either to everyone or all panelists. Keep your chat and questions on topic, and professional and respectful at all times. We have planned this session to run for about 1 hour or up to 1 hour, and our members can receive advanced training. Master Naturalists can receive advanced training credit for watching it live or watching the recording of the TMN Tuesday webinars later after the fact. If you're experiencing WebEx issues with WebEx or getting on, you can refer to our WebEx help guide, and we'll drop the chat, that link there in the chat. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Chris Schenck, our state fire program leader with Texas Parks and Wildlife, in our May speaker for TMN Tuesday May event, to talk about wildfire or prescribed fire history and management in Texas. Thank you, Chris.
And so, Chris, I am passing you the presenter rights, and you should now see on the bottom of your screen the ability to share.
Right on. So I got trained in this last week. Let's see if I can actually remember it all. So, no. See, we go back to share, and I'm going to go to the PowerPoint if I'm not mistaken.
You can do that, yes, sir.
Yep. Let's see, and then I'm getting slideshow.
That works.
All right, we're in the right place. Thank you, Michelle, for teaming up with me, and thank you also, Mary Pearl. So I'm deeply honored to get to visit with this group. The Texas Master Naturalist, as I've come to know, are a wonderful grassroots core group that help in so many different ways. And I've been privileged in the past to get to do a workshop at one of your big meetings when we were still having those. And if it's actually possible in the fall, probably the division would be open to that, but that's too soon to tell right now. So see if we're gonna do okay here. I'm just making sure I can advance, and let me get.
Okay. We're seeing the first slide, and you should be able to.
There we go. There we go. Thank you. We just started off. So Michelle did a really nice job talking about my bio, and it's kind of an interesting thing. So I spent a great deal of my early career fighting fire, And now I think I have to make amends for some of that because maybe fighting every fire wasn't the whole answer. Today in my work, our work in the wildlife division is primarily prescribed fire, which is maybe fighting the fire before the fire even starts. And so been grateful for my career in the U.S. Forest Service for quite a few years, and getting to be in a lot of places. We landed in Texas at the end of the career. The U.S. Forest Service asks you to retire at age 57 if you're in fire management, and I just barely figured out what I was doing. So I was blessed to get this great job with Texas Parks and Wildlife Division. My wife reminds me that it's probably one of my happiest places these days. I work with 300 wonderful people and our partners, that sort of thing. But probably the most important thing about me is I'm like you. I live here in Texas. I live in a tiny town, not even a town, but it's called Beulah, just east of Bear Creek, which was running quite heavily in the 4 inches of rain we received the other day. And so our fur family was pretty excited. Andrew, Timmy, and Petey, and then of course our Australian Shepherds. And the disclaimer might be at any minute my office assistants may run in to my home office and try to help out here. You know how your fur family is. So I'm grateful for this opportunity and for this assignment and to try to make a difference here in Texas. So our topic, of course, is about prescribed fire, a little bit about our history and a little bit about fire effects, and really a question I posed right in the beginning. So why burn? Why burn? And I think in the preamble to the thing, I discussed, or I gave the ladies some information about that most people have a natural fear of fire. That's probably well deserved. You just have to turn on the news almost any time of year, because somewhere in the world or somewhere in our country, there's a wildfire going on, that sort of thing. Also, understanding our history. If you're not a student of history, you're bound to be a victim of it. And I would also say if you're not a student of fire, you can become a victim of it as well, but that's in my profession. Prescribed fire effects. It's nice to know if you're going to mess with the dragon, what it's going to do. So, in any good lesson, we want to have some objectives. So we're not trying to make everybody a prescribed fire specialist today. We'll entertain that sometime. But developing a brief understanding of fire history in our country and in Texas. And then also understanding how various ecosystems came to be under the influence of a disturbance, and in this case, it's fire. And then understanding what those effects might be on the land, and having a mental picture of perhaps how you would like your land to look. And also, I hope that some people would consider using fire as a tool. In fact, we got an email this morning from a participant who's already excited and ready to go, and we'll follow up with that at a future time. Sort of thing. So this is probably not super new news to all. In our fire history world, we became aware that Native Americans used fire for hunting and rejuvenating the prairies and other lands that they lived on. Probably Native Americans had not heard of Smokey Bear because he only showed up in the middle of the last century. And so whether it was lightning that started a fire and then they made observations about the results, or they maybe were traveling through and didn't put the last spark out of their campfire and it burned, and they noticed things. They picked up on, wow, that fire went through. It was a little bit scary, but oh my goodness, the buffalo came back to these new green sprouts of grass. And of course, the buffalo was pretty important to them. They got food, fiber, and shelter from the products that came from the buffalo. As the pioneers came along in the West and in Texas, they were somewhat less enthusiastic about fire because livestock grazing was a very foundational occupation in the early days of Texas. Fire was not well thought of, and in fact, it was and still possibly is a law that about the time Texas became a state, that burning grass in Texas was illegal. And in fact, that's the way our laws still read, is that burning is illegal, but then they go on and provide exceptions in that. And that's a whole nother topic area, that sort of thing. Also in our country's history, which kind of parallel Texas, probably right at the early part of this century, and we've read these stories, the great 1910 fires that really changed public attitude. The agency that I once worked for, the U.S. Forest Service, built some foundational attitudes and policies and procedures about wildland fires or wildfires, and pretty much put every one of them out. And even in those early days where some of the southern forests who had seen the usefulness of fire wanted to apply fire to the land, that was somewhat of not a good idea. In fact, they had a group of people called the Dixie Crusaders who often went around preaching how bad fire was. So in recent history, as we've seen changes in Texas, all kinds of changes, or better livestock raising where land managers are rotating their livestock and making better use of rangelands and such, we're seeing a lot more benefits to prescribed fire in various ecosystems. Our fire culture is slowly developing or redeveloping. I like to use the term rekindling the burn culture in Texas, and all of us can play a part in that. The perceptions from large wildfires, so they're right in the middle of the screen, snapshot that came actually not far from our headquarters in Austin of the Bastrop fire, which was indeed one of the worst fires in the history of Texas, most destructive fires, 2011, and then followed up by some other fires not too many years afterwards. So our perceptions are changing, but we're also realizing that there are things we can do. Fire or prescribed fire is one of the most economical land treatments that we can use. I hate to say it's cheap, but it's less expensive than some other treatments, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. You know, another thing, more prescribed fire in urban areas. Skyline, which is that of the fourth largest city in America. We were about a month ago, or a little bit more than a month ago, with Houston Nature Center, the Parks Division of Houston, and the city fire department. They happen to be the third largest fire department, they remind me. And we conducted a not too big, significant 7.5 acre prescribed fire in the heart of the city. And what we learned is it could be done. It took a lot of teamwork, a lot of coordination, even some work with some department people, but we found out it could be done in a unique area. And a desire to do more of that, because the land, regardless if it's surrounded with lands, the land still has some needs for non-treatment with prescribed fire. So
Hey,
homework,
Chris,
and if you didn't do
can
your
I
homework,
interrupt you for just a
yes,
second?
ma'am. Sure.
Your audio is a little bit jumpy, and I think it's your internet connection.
Oh,
As much as I'd love to continue to see your face, can you turn your video off and see if that helps to boost your audio?
I sure will, Michelle. Let me get to the right screen for that.
Thank you for letting me pause you midstream.
You betcha. Settings. And, because I'm on this big screen, I'm not totally sure my best way to do that.
Of course. I can stop it for you. Would you like me to do that?
That would be great. I'm happy to
Okay,
do
so
that.
your video is off, and hopefully that will help reduce
Right.
the load on your internet.
A little bit of
Your
better
discussion.
You betcha.
Yes, sir. Your discussion on the Memorial Park burn was pretty jumpy. If you wouldn't mind starting back there, and then we'll keep going from there.
Okay, let's see if we can do that. So just to step backwards, Memorial Park was a cool project that involved City of Houston's fire department, the third largest fire department in the nation, as they reminded me, it also involved the Parks Department and then the Houston Arboretum and Nature Center. And we were able to put fire in front of a very large city, do it safely. Our smoke was not a huge issue, and we were able to get things done there. So just kind of a synopsis of that. That coming out okay, Michelle and Mary?
Yes, perfect. You sound much better.
Okay. As we move a little bit further along, some of you may have watched your homework video, Land in Balance. It's a great video produced by both Texas A&M Extension, the Texas Forest Service, and Texas Parks and Wildlife. A lot of players who still play shared the importance of fire overall. If you haven't watched it, it's a great watch. It's not even a bad watch with your family, that sort of thing. And you know, I drew some talking points that we've used overall in fire, but and these are talking points that are pretty common to most groups and organizations who are looking at fire as a tool. And you know, one, just to read it aloud for you guys, you know, fire's been part of a natural process for almost forever, at least in our civilization. Prescribed fire is a safer, easier, and less expensive way to manage wildfires being the unwanted ones. Society has influenced the historic fire cycles. As I mentioned, in our early history in this country, we started putting them all out in almost a military fervor, that sort of thing. Planned prescribed fires and other fuels treatments can improve the land and prevent wildfires by providing better opportunities for firefighters to protect property and people. And we'll draw this out with a couple case study or two as we come along in the video. And then improving the health of the land and reducing the undesirable impacts of wildfire in Texas. It's going to require us all, you know, government agencies, tribal governments, industry, fire departments, communities, and most of all the private landowner, as our state is almost 98% private land. And so a great group like the Master Naturalist will play a significant role in getting more prescribed fire safely on the land. So let me see, I hope I can go in here. So I'm going to just take a minute here. I'm still shared, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, it's just not completely wanting to advance. So let me just keep coming
If you
along.
hover in the bottom left-hand corner of the slideshow, you should see little advance arrows. Sometimes you can also use your keyboard arrows, and you press the forward arrow, and that should get you to the next slide as well.
See what happens. Up. I got that help. So,
Yes, sir.
we was kind of hinting at fire effects. So, and when you talk about both, what in what we're talking about, wildland fire is both wildfire and prescribed fire. So individual fires vary in what they burn, that's the fuel, and fire managers think about vegetation and leaves and twigs and litters and trees as fuel, where regular people call them all those things. Okay, so what's burning, where these things are burning, or the spread or the pattern. Are they just burning along the ground? Or are they actually up in that third dimension, up in the trees and the canopy or the tops of the plants? That's a place where when the fire goes there, it's not particularly good. When things burn, seasonality or even just the cool word, I can't even say that right. But whether they're burning in the daytime or nighttime, it makes a difference. Seasonality also plays into how the fire affects plants and animals. There's some times where we don't want to burn because we know it would negatively affect ground nesting birds, for instance, or whatnot. Or the timing could affect what plants we kill or what plants we cause to flourish. How intensely they burn, the heat released or resonance. Did it burn slowly and back up through the fuel, or did it run rapidly and through that? And sometimes we want one or the other. And how long? How long did it stay on the ground? That sort of thing. So some other fire effects that we narrate are that fires do reduce the risk of wildfire. Story, the thick, dense understory. So I live here in East Texas, and it seems to rain a lot, especially lately. And there are places in the woods that I think a rabbit could get through, but anything than that might be a little tricky. So a fire in those thick understories help animals move through the forest better and utilize the vegetation there, or actually converts that. It also improves wildlife or grazing habitats. Sometimes we have such a buildup of old fuel, of dead dry grass, that material keeps other new and fresh vegetation from growing. Forest and grazing and grassland regeneration is somewhat dependent on that fire causes. It helps that. We are also aware that it cycles nutrients. It releases some nutrients that have been sitting dormant. And then many species are fire dependent. Both plants and animals count on fire. Insects and diseases can often be reduced and negated by fire, that sort of thing. And then, of course, I used the word forest here because I think I was directing this original presentation to an East Texas fuel model, but it helps people get through. Even in the brush country of West Texas, some of that ground is so thick that only really skinny jackrabbits can run around there. So we talk about fuel reduction, and I kind of mentioned that, you know, fire managers think of things that burn, the vegetation, the flowers, the grass, the leaves. We think of it as fuel, but a lot of times we need to reduce that fuel. It's become too thick or too heavy. And there are methods, fuel reduction. The general big five, I might say, are mechanical pieces of equipment that are used to chop up, chip up, mow, grind, etc. Chemical, which are usually herbicides or pesticides. Sometimes there's a different, reaction to those, and there's some people who like and dislike that. Fire is one of them. Grazing has long since been a common tool for fuel reduction. Cows eat grass and other vegetation, as well as wildlife and such. And timber harvest is not unusual in many parts of the state, that sort of thing. So as I describe those methods of fuel reduction, it's like to realize that almost all of those methods leave some residual. If we chip up the forest, there's still chips on the ground. If we spray, there's still dry and dead material. It takes quite a while in some environments for that to go away. If we are timber harvesting, there is often material left behind. Non-marshable material is often left behind. In fact, sometimes I look and I say, man, if I just gathered that up out there in that old clear cut, I could probably have a campfire in my backyard for 20 years. And believe it or not, our friends the cows do leave something if you don't have to. That sort of thing. The cool thing about fire and residue from fire is that we are using a term of pyrolysis and we're rapidly oxidizing the fuel. So here's a picture of the grass in this environment before the fire. There's that black. And then actually I love the phoenix rises from the ashes, and we see some beautiful grasses return in months post burning, that sort of thing. So it's something that we can actually do, and we can use fire as a follow-up for those other previously noted fuel reduction methods. This is a super great scientific picture of different parts of the plants and how they can be affected. Probably the least desirable effect would be over towards the right side of the slide, where we really don't want, with desirable plants, we don't want to kill the roots and things like that. However, with undesirable plants, we often like to hit that and hit the roots. And the timing and seasonality of our burning will often play in that. Not going to make you an expert on that, and sometimes I count on the biologist to tell me when is the best time to burn for what species. So just a little bit of science there. And here's another. You know, it looks like, you know, the larger jackrabbits or other animals immediately post burn look unpleasant. But amazingly enough, not too long after that time, things started. And the neighbor down the street, I ended up helping him burn. He was out with a paper sack and he was trying to burn. So I gladly helped him. As we were doing this, he says, "Well, what should we plant here after it's burned?" And I said, "Well, maybe nothing, because you would be amazed that after burning, what's been sitting dormant in your soils might just show up." I've been burning the hillside in front of my small house here in East Texas since we've lived here. And today, without much of my help, some of those beautiful wildflowers that had been sitting there for a long, long time have showed up more and more each year. So sometimes that phoenix rises from the ashes that we didn't even know was there. Now, I was going to talk about the wildfire concept because we did mention it's Wildfire Prevention Month. So not too foreign to some of you who live in Central Texas or who watched the news in September of 2011, it's the Bastrop Complex fire. There's actually a couple fires that started, unfortunately, from power lines that didn't ground out or grounded out and caused two fires during some pretty strong winds. Firefighters, you know, did their traditional attack on the fire and were unsuccessful in their early initial attack, and that fire went on for many days. Overall, the fire burned 33,000 acres. It destroyed 1,600 homes, which would be bigger than the community that I live in. There were sadly 2 fatalities, and I frankly don't have the figures because they probably continue to change on suppression costs, what it costs to fight the fire, and more importantly, what it costs to recover, whether it's the recovery of the land, the loss in people's houses, their property, and their productivity. So very destructive fire. But as bad as it was, go ahead.
You have a great question that has come up in the chat, and there's a couple of other questions that have come up in the chat that I think you're going to cover later, but one that kind of relates to the Bastrop fire, and I was actually in Bastrop County when the fire got started, but can you talk about the concerns of air pollution related to wildfires versus related to prescribed burning?
That is a great question. So one way to just simply capstone that is to say, when and where and how much. Okay, we know that even in a prescribed burn, we're going to be making smoke and particulates and pollution. But since we plan that on the day that we want to plan it, under the conditions that we want it to be, and with the wind speed and direction and the mixing heights appropriate, a lot of times we're not creating as bad of a problem, or we're metering it out. And it's really great when you look at the picture there. What's that? Right at the shopping mall, the Home Depot, pointing towards the hills in Bastrop. That wasn't a good day. Well, it wasn't a good day for a lot of reasons, but we didn't get good results with smoke. Too much, too long, and at the wrong time. It wasn't mixing and scouring in with the clouds in the upper atmosphere. So with prescribed fire, part of our prescription is smoke and where it goes and what it does. The wildfire, we get little, if any, choice over those conditions. So we can detrimentally, in some of the western states, and even in our state, we will often see concentrations of smoke from distant fires, depending on what the upper atmosphere and the the winds, the jet streams bring. And there are valleys in pristine places in Montana and Idaho where people live under unhealthy smoke conditions for weeks, if not months, from that unwanted wildfire. So that is a potential challenge from that. Excellent question. Mary Pearl, is there another one or two before we keep going?
You have another great question, but I think you're going to cover it later. It was talking about landowner assistance for hosting prescribed burns on properties owned by master naturalists.
So we're going to actually get to that in a few, and so we'll clarify any of that. If it doesn't get clarified, we sure want you to ask that. And you know, I've always said when I talk to people and talk to fellow firefighters, the only dumb question is one that you don't ask. So never be hesitant, please. I'd be happy to answer it. And beyond this talk, I think my contact information's around. I'm sure that I'll be happy to answer the question, or some of our great staff out there will as well. So there's that Bastrop fire. Mary Pearl has cemented that snapshot into her mind. It affected her. It affected a lot of Texans. There's a lot of people who knows somebody who was affected by that, or other very similar events, either here in our state or throughout the country. As bad as that fire was, this is a really cool picture. Some of you watched Fire in the Balance, actually saw this area, and Greg Creasy, who's one of the leaders in the State Parks Division, who actually was stationed in Bastrop, spoke from right at there. As you can see, the arrow talks about the fire's movement. This was this Bastrop fire that was moving across this area. On the right-hand side of the viewer's picture is an area that had not received any previous treatment. And so that fire, that wildfire, went into that third dimension, into the crowns and the treetops. It was, to say the least, an extremely angry fire that firefighters have very few options. It's usually a highly defensive and protective mode. However, on the other side of the street there, the dirt road, there was an area that had had prescribed fire and some mechanical fuel treatment over previous years, as recently as the year before. In that area, the fire literally dropped back down to the surface and became a far more manageable surface fire where the firefighters could do a much better job, a safer job for them and a more effective job where the fire was on the surface. So this is an excellent example in one of the worst fires in the history of Texas, where that treatment of the usefulness of prescribed fire was profoundly brought out. And we use that example as often as possible. And it's reflected and mirrored across the country, from East Texas and the Bering fire that just 6 months or 4 months before Bastrop was considered a bad fire. When that Bering fire ran up into the Davy Crockett National Forest, doing timber harvesting, fuels management, firefighters had a better chance of being successful. And way out west, the famous fire in Colorado, known as the Hayman Fire, what kept the Hayman Fire into the valley that Denver is in was an 8,000 acre prescribed burn a year before, called the Bohemus burn. Controversial in itself because people didn't like it. People sure liked it after it stopped the fire from coming over the firefighters a fighting chance to manage an unruly wildfire, that sort of thing. So little further from home. So some of you guys also did your homework and saw the business of burning, which is really a recap of how we conduct landscape scale prescribed fires on Texas parks and wildlife properties. And you know, it shows that there's a little bit of organization and structure. I would tell you that not to sweat that. It applies, but landowner prescribed fires are usually a little simpler. We usually help landowners to plan prescribed fires at a simpler, lower complexity level, smaller in size oftentimes, and under conditions that aren't necessarily as challenging as we might face. The Matador is a beautiful place. That was one of my early times on the job. My job was to take the photographer around, driving Mr. Daisy or whatever, but it's one of the more challenging places we burn up in the panhandle of Texas, that sort of thing. So, and then I'm just going to talk just briefly before I get into some things about prescribed fire in Texas, a little bit by the numbers. As we're rekindling this burn culture, we talk about figures and numbers and things like that. And so you can see, once again, that big blue part of the pie chart. And I apologize, that's not the clearest picture I could have used, and that sort of thing. But well over 100,000 acres of prescribed fire is conducted by contractors, by certified, insured, prescribed burners. And then if you look at some other wedges, prescribed burn associations conduct quite a bit of fire, but not necessarily big acres, but probably lots and lots of smaller burns. Landowners the same. As you look at the pie chart, the State Parks Division and the Wildlife Division, probably have around 50,000 acres of fire that they get on the ground. Uniquely, the Wildlife Division also helps landowners burn, and we'll talk more about that. And then our federal partners do quite a bit of burning. The real thing is it's going to take all of us. I've done a scientific wild guess about how much fire needs to be on the ground in Texas to make our ecosystems run well. And I'm kind of guessing based on what I think is burnable land in Texas that's not cities or water or in direct agricultural production. And I'm thinking that a number like 5 million acres a year is what Texas ought to be burning. Amazingly enough, smaller states like Florida and Kansas and Oklahoma are burning 1 million acres a year. We're doing, 400,000, but I think we can do better, and it's going to take all of us to do that. That's why this group is very important. So effects and land management, so what? What do I need to do? I'm a landowner, or I'm friends of landowners. We have small inholdings, we have prairies and things like that. What should I do? So what? Well, having a goal in mind is important. Okay. And consulting a specialist, and I put an asterisk there because there's lots of specialists out there. Sometimes they're just people with a briefcase and they're out of town, something like that. Developing a measurable and achievable plan. Sometimes we want a lot of bang for our buck. We're Americans. We solve mysteries in 30 minutes on television, that sort of thing. Sometimes our prescribed burners are like, oh, I wanted to burn it, and I wanted to be black from wall to wall. I tend to like area rugs a lot more than wall-to-wall carpet, just a personal decision. And I think about when nature burned things, whether it was that lightning strike or that leftover pioneer campfire, maybe, it just burned little spots here and there. Maybe it burned from creek to creek. It happened in some format, but wall-to-wall might not have been part of it. So measurable and achievable is important. I think it's important that you be able to implement the plan, and sometimes smaller pieces and parts are better. So a couple of years ago, we were in a meeting at the College Station, and the question came out and it said, well, how much acreage is it worth for the different practitioners to burn? Well, the commercial burners, they gave a number, and some other groups gave numbers, some agencies gave numbers. And of course, I'm never at a loss for words. We came around to the table and said, well, in our program where we work with landowners, we would probably burn 1 acre if the landowner asked. We would probably help them burn that, because while it may not be super significant to the whole state, it is to that landowner. I never thought for a minute that a week or two later I would get a call from University of Houston at Clear Lake, and we would go help them learn to burn about 2/10 of an acre, but significant. And a whole bunch of Master Naturalists came and helped that happen. So implementing a plan, no matter how small, is valuable. Monitor your progress, make changes as needed, and then enjoy what's happening from your burning. So I'm going to kind of better define how can I get involved if I'm a master naturalist or just a good landowner. this activity today is sort of like the one fourth of a community workshop. But as we can get out and about, as COVID changes, and we can get back to meeting in person in safe places, we hope we'll have more landowner community workshops, which often culminate with actual hands-on burn, because most of us learn by doing. Most of us are very tactile and like to hold the drip torch and see the results of that. You can also, in Texas, hire a certified insured prescribed burn manager. These are people that are trained, they're insured, they're bonded, and they take on the financial responsibility or liability. I can stumble over that. Liability for the burn. And since I said that, I won't say that there aren't liability issues with burning, but they're not insurmountable. They're manageable and they're doable. And when we talk to people, we explain that. There are a lot of what are called prescribed burn associations in Texas throughout the state, coastal, prairie, even some that are sprouting up in the piney woods of Texas. These are groups of people, neighbors helping neighbors, and it's a wonderful group that helps folks burn. It kind of, to me, is a lot like the historic days of barn raising. Nobody could build a barn by themselves, so neighbors helping neighbors. We don't really build a lot of barns today, but the concept is there. Reaching out to one of our biologists or a regional fire coordinator. We have a program called Technical Guidance in Prescribed Fire, a little more in a minute on that, but they can often help landowners learn how to burn. Our friends at Texas A&M Forest Service have some programs, and they have some funding opportunities for people hiring work. Also, the Natural Resource Conservation Service has some different programs for burning and some financial opportunities. The folks at AgriLife are great folks, and they've got a whole extensive training library and some different thoughts and ideas there. And then more and more, we're finding out that local fire departments want to pitch in, want to help, sometimes view prescribed fire as it's a training opportunity. We work with a coastal prairie near Lamarck, and for some reason or another, the Lamarck Fire Department finally got in touch with one of the leaders of the prairie, and today the fire department is taking a leadership role in putting fire on the ground on this coastal prairie, and they're benefiting because they're getting that hands-on training for when they do have to go to an unwanted wildfire on the wrong day. So it's a win-win. Our partnership with the Houston Fire Department was another fine example that we've got a municipal fire department and the natural resource group with the parks teaming up today to get fire on the ground for two purposes: ecological benefit and training opportunities for firefighters. So ways to get involved. Too far there. Speaking of our technical guidance program, what we do on private lands. And this is a bit of a quote from a letter that I send people, but I tell people prescribed fire makes sense. Our division would work with you to develop a burn plan that includes a prescribed fire prescription. And when the conditions are right, i.e. in prescription, we team up with members of your family and your neighbors for that burn day of implementation. And then on that day, the landowner is actually the burn boss, but we're right there. We're guiding them. We're in somewhat of a unified command. And we'll bring some prescribed fire equipment and some of our people, just like the neighbors do. And so we want to meet people face to face, one-on-one. Sometimes they'll also invite other neighbors or other people to come see that burn. And our goal is not to be a service. I mean, we want to be of service, but we think that the service that we're really providing is we want to teach landowners that many of them can do it themselves. And there's some controversy over that because we're not in any way wishing to compete with industry that does this. But some landowners are kind of small and maybe industry isn't well geared or equipped to come by for 5 acres. On the other hand, you meet people at Lowe's and Home Depot every weekend when I'm down there getting a piece or a part. And there are just some people here in Texas with that true spirit of they want to do things themselves. They want that stewardship over their land. So that's a really important and cool thing. So it begins with making contact with a local biologist. Go ahead, Mary, you might have a question pop in here.
Yes, I do actually. This question was asked earlier and I was holding on to it until you got to this slide. There was a question about, I think you answered the question on what resources are available for landowners, but there was a question about the liability and you touched on it briefly, but the specific question is when a controlled burn escapes its desired boundaries, whether done on private property or public property, who bears the liability caused by that escaped fire?
There you go. So the way the state law reads today is the landowner and the burn boss. And some, in the case of our private lands program, the landowner and burn boss are one and the same. In the case of our public lands, the burn boss, that would be me or one of our fire coordinators or one of our biologists. And so it goes back to, in our case, the agency on our public lands. And so, you know, what can be done? Training is valuable and important. Part of the burn plan is to reduce the probability of escapes. I will tell you that on a national basis, and it's true here in Texas, less than 1% of planned prescribed fires, keyword, planned prescribed fires, less than 1% of those fires escape, and defined escape require outside help to extinguish the fire, outside help. It's not unusual for an ember or brand of fire to hop up and hop over the fire line, but most of the time, because we have a plan and we have a contingency plan, we can put that fire out rather quickly and it becomes a non-event. But there are rare occasions. So the liability thing, not to play that down, says that the landowner and the burn boss are responsible. So if the landowner hires a certified insured burn boss, that person completely bears that liability, and they have to have insurance. The state law says they have to have $1 million worth of insurance and $2 million aggregate. Hopefully they wouldn't have two events in 1 year. Our agency actually has insurance as well, because we had an escape once. We've had other escapes that stayed on the property and such. So the key factor, though, I'm going to reiterate is we hear about other problems, and they label them, quote, control burns. We try to use the word prescribed fire. The word prescribed meaning prescription, well planned out and thought out. The lowest common denominator, and I see this, is I see just people go out, they just light something on fire with really little planned forethought, and sometimes, like the man just down the street from me, he lit the pasture on fire and he went to watch the football game sometime in February, and lo and behold, pretty soon the neighbor's place was on fire and the plantation was on fire. He had no plan and he had no responsibility there, and he could have borne a huge liability because that was willful and you know, destructive because he just didn't have a plan. So I'm waxing for a long time. We don't want to place fear in people's heart, but we want to say that when we have a prescription, when the conditions are right, and when we're working together, those things come together and we reduce that possibility. Many landowners can get an additional rider on their home or ranch insurance that covers prescribed fire. Some of our cooperators, some of our landowners have picked up for an additional $100 a policy from their company. And one of them said that was money well spent. That sort of thing. I went on for a long time with that, but it was a fair question. Thank you.
Thank you.
We good to go? So this is also linked to our fire page that you guys have I think you made some handouts available, Mary and Michelle. And so these are our regional fire coordinators. Bobby Scott is up in the Panhandle region, actually most of West Texas, from the Panhandle all the way down to Brewster County and to the river down there in mainly West Texas. Region 2, Wesley Evans, kind of central Texas. He has the hill country and up into the Dallas-Fort Worth area and down around San Antonio, not quite into San Antonio, but more of the hill country before you get in the plains. Region 3, Tony Aguilar, he has a lot of East Texas, Northeast Texas, the Piney Woods. And then Region 4, my good friend Greg Pleasant, who's actually in Giddings, Texas. Greg's region goes from Texaco, or Beaumont, Texas, to Mexico, all the way over to the Rio Grande, some big areas. So besides myself, we have 4 of us who are primarily focused on fire, but we have another 150 field-going employees who are qualified to work with fire, and who are sometimes the very first wave of people that the public meet. I'm really proud that within the division, and these are people that have received additional training in fire management. They quote, have a red card and a fire qualification, and shortly they're going to do a physical fitness test called a pack test, where they carry a heavy pack for 3 miles pretty quickly. It's not the most fun thing I get to do either, but essentially I'm grateful for 150 collateral duty firefighters. It makes me feel like the Wildlife Division has about 150 of the best volunteer firefighters Texas can have, at least wildland firefighters. So these are our fire coordinators, and this will of course be posted, and then the same thing is listed in our fire page. I'm going to also go forward, and yep, so this is my contact information, and most importantly, I think, is the fire page there, which is in our Texas. If you went to Texas Parks and Wildlife and then kind of pointed yourself towards land and water and fire management, a lot of the stuff that I've talked about is here. There's other links. It's examples of a fire, a prescribed fire burn plan, that sort of thing. So these are really good resources for folks. And now is the chance for the additional questions or I guess I would say if they're burning issues or hot topics, I'm real open to those, and I know some people will contact me, and I'll make another disclaimer. We were going to make another video just like the business of burning about private lands. We hate to advertise because we don't want to be less effective and get to people. Patience is important because we're dealing with a natural process, and helping people learn to burn. You know, I had a burn in southern Idaho. It took me 7 years to get the right conditions to burn it. So I'm hoping we don't take that long with people with patience. So I'm open to many questions from you great people, or a few.
Great, thank you. Chris, thank you so very much. We have a ton of questions coming in, and I'm going to try and ask as many as I can. I realize that we're at that 1 o'clock hour, so thank you for keeping us perfectly on time today. And if you'd like, Chris, if you can manage, you can stop sharing your screen and start sharing your video so we can see your face. I apologize about the audio issues, sometimes just bandwidth connections in small town Beulah, Texas, may cause some issues with Chris's audio. So thanks y'all for being patient. Chris, 2 questions that are related, and I'm going to ask them together, and hopefully you can tie in an answer for these 2 questions. One is, how do we balance providing dead wood habitat for wildlife with fuel reduction in small woodland areas? And then the second question is similarly related to habitat concerns for wildlife, is when you are planning a controlled or a planned burn, is there any effort, and how so, to assess animal life to allow them to remove for themselves or escape from the area prior to burn?
So those are both excellent questions. So one of the things that I think about in some wooded areas, especially sometimes when we get brush piles that either we establish or establish themselves, is if your goal is to get rid of the brush, you don't want to wait too long to burn a pile, because we know that wild creatures look at those piles as a great home, and you'd hate for them to have a condominium built in there and then, you know, burn down their condo. So if you're thinking of getting rid of brush piles, do it quickly. If you're thinking of doing a broadcast burn in that same area, I would tell people not to worry about piling it. I would say to do that broadcast burn, you know, burn the whole area. Now, the second part of that, and hopefully I'll do this well enough, is people are always concerned, what about terrestrial species, or even, you know, airborne species? how are they going to react to fire, whether prescribed or wild? One disclaimer is that many of these species came to be with fire. And even though maybe there hasn't been fire recently, they probably have some memory of or education, or maybe mother animals tell babies, run away from fire. I have to laugh because Bambi taught how to run away from fire when a hunter shot his mother. I don't know what to say about that, but it was an interesting show. Uh, at any rate, a lot of times animals are pretty good at that. But one of the reasons why I never do a lot of this work without talking to our specialists, to our biologists, to our Jason Harden is one of our turkey specialists, upland game birds, actually is a better word, is to remember that there are seasonalities to nesting and birthing activities amongst animals, and paying attention to that is important. So the timing is also huge. So for instance, wild turkeys are wildly popular in different parts of the state. Species that has come and gone. People like to see them, people like to hunt them. During their nesting time, their ground nesters, we would avoid and suggest avoiding burning, or we would suggest burning smaller chunks of land, not thousands of acres, but maybe hundreds as opposed to that. So those animals have a place to go. And the other thing, to be honest, is there are times where you could have a loss of an individual animal. But overall, the species and the ecosystem is probably still benefited by the habitat improvement of fire. So I'd never say never that you couldn't have a loss of an animal, but generally the population overall has a benefit. So we strive to manage our timing as best as possible. That's seasonality of burning. I hope that helped.
Yeah, I think that's great. That actually ties into another question talking about, and just for those that are still with us, we're going to go until about 1:15 or so, and then we'll let Chris get on with his day. So I've got just another 10 minutes or so, if you don't mind, of us asking some questions. One of the other two questions that kind of came in very similar is talking about minimum land acreage for prescribed burn, but then also treatment and preparation of land that has not been burned in numbers of years. What are some methods for managing overgrowth yaupon in tree canopies that may not have had a fire in 60 years?
Mm-hmm. So I live on a very small piece of ground, 1.47 acres in Beulah, Idaho, and I've been burning my land since I moved here. My wife and I, and Coco and Ellie now. So sometimes those burns are barely a half an acre, of land. So it's not impossible to look at small amounts. So I'd say that there's like not really a minimum. Now, the other side of it is when fire has been absent for a long time. We had a really fine landowner call our hotline, helpline, and he also called our friends at TFS at the same time. So myself and a regional forester, district forester, went and visited this landowner. And exactly as you painted the picture, thick old yaupon, thick old trees that hadn't been, had timber harvesting, hadn't had fire, hadn't had nothing. And we drove around with the landowner, hiked around, and sat down with him and said, we really don't recommend you burn this. And he goes, what? I thought you'd all be about burning. We said, no, you probably need to do some of these other things. So we recommended some mechanical treatments. We recommended he get a contractor with a bobcat and a forestry head and make some little trails and roads and reduce that. And at this point in time, he's reduced that thick yaupon, and he's made some small areas, and he can actually now more safely get fire on the ground. So sometimes we have to do those mechanical things when we've gotten sort of had fire excluded for a really long time. So, but there's other tools that we can use. Indeed, I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. And then we were talking about the size, the I guess, ideal minimum acreage for prescribed burns, but you may talk about working with your neighbors on a cooperative approach for prescribed burn and what y'all have done with that in the past.
Well, so there's some cool things that have happened. So one interesting thing about fire, when we see wildfire and wildland fire, it respects no political, social, or otherwise subdivision. It burns everybody's land the same when it's unwanted. But there are some real great success stories of where um, neighbors worked out where they would burn on, quote, both sides of the fence. And we need to learn how to do that ourselves. And we've done that in a couple places where we have in holdings, and it would have been more trouble to exclude the neighbors in holding, and we worked out having a private lands burn in the middle of a public land area. But cooperatives and burn associations are really great opportunities. Most people, it's mom and dad and maybe some adult children or some young children. And so on the burn day, might call for like 6 people, but they're like 3 short or whatever. So, but they've got a neighbor who has a similar idea in mind. And these cooperative groups or burn associations are great ways for neighbors helping neighbors. Usually start small. We have a wonderful example in San Jacinto County. We have a landowner. He began to do some work, and he hired a contractor, but the contractor got so busy he couldn't get back. For many, many years. The landowner said, "Boy, if I don't get this burned, I'm afraid I'm going to be starting all over." So he actually attended one of our workshops, and he approached us, and we said, "Yeah, I think we could probably work something out." He brought a bunch of his neighbors just to kind of check it out, and they sort of liked what they saw, and today they're starting to form up this grassroots group, just neighbors helping neighbors. And what I love is at the end of every burn that we help with, we do an after action review, and we ask people, what they thought. And the common thread that I love to hear is, "Man, I was nervous about this. This worried me. I was afraid. But now I see that it can be done." When the other neighbor says, "Maybe I'd like to try this over my place." And so this very guy that I was talking about, the neighbor lady next door, said, "I've got this pasture. I saw what happened with yours. Can you and your sons come over and help me out?" And he came over, and they kind of planned it out like we had showed them how to plan it out. And he says, "She took her blood pressure medicine, but then when we burned, it worked out okay. And now she's sold." And so I love the grassroots things. The same thing we're seeing on some of the prairies is that the neighbors teaming up or groups teaming up. I think the Master Naturalists are probably a perfect fit for this. They've already got structure and organization, and some people have a piece of land to burn, and some people are just happy to help. So it probably fits well. I hope that helps.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So we've got just 5 more minutes, and I've got a ton of really great questions. So Chris, I may copy some of these into an email and see what short answers you can provide by an email, and we'll post it to our website later. No guarantees on that. So I'm going to pick out of these incredible questions, one that I think is particularly interesting for me is the question on the potential for controlling invasives with fire. This question specifically is talking about urban area invasives, but I think you can talk about it in an urban versus rural perspective as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think that prescribed fire is going to be a great tool for invasives, regardless of what their demographics are. It's probably just a matter of the timing in the particular invasives. So, whether it's an urban area or a highly rural area, fire can play that role. Just got to decide what they are, and then that seasonality becomes a huge deal. A lot of times we do a lot of burning in dormant season, when things are dried out, maybe we call that winter. But we're seeing a lot more success at dealing with woody invasives during what we'll call growing season or warm season, because those plants have their energy up in the higher area, whereas during the dormant season, their energy's down the roots. So we disturb them, but we don't kill them. So that timing is a key factor. So seasonality plays a role in in woody invasives often.
That makes so much sense, just thinking about it from that level of plant biology. And kind of related, you mentioned the winter dormant season and burning. What are your predictions or forecasting with the winter storm Uri die-offs of some native and invasive plants? Has that increased fuel load? Are we going to see higher fire potentials this summer? And that'll be my last question for today too.
Yeah. So there's a good chance that's probably so. We did observe, and I think I shared with your ecologist in a previous meeting, that just post Uri, we saw fire behavior on some of our public lands and private lands that was not supported by the weather conditions. So our guess was that super freeze froze plants and caused them to become more receptive to fire. We also are seeing things where there's considerable die-off or late sprouting with different deciduous trees, and even conifers. Look, I never saw yellow pine trees in my life. So my friends at Texas A&M Forest Service, when we were just talking about this, said we are not fully able to get our head wrapped around it because we don't have, I mean, it was like 100 years before something like that, or 60 years happened. People in the Intermountain West aren't thinking about things burning when there's snow on the ground. So I would say there's a good possibility of that, and we need to pay close attention to plants. Also, I think I saw the caution from our friends at A&M Forest Service that said, don't get in too much of a hurry to cut something down. It may not be dead.
Yep, absolutely. And with that, Chris, I'll close out our TMN Tuesday event. Thank you so much for joining us this month. We really appreciate it. For those that are still with us on Facebook Live or are in our WebEx event, we'll be taking all of the links and resources that Chris has shared. We'll be posting those to our website, our txmn.tamu.edu. our TMN Tuesday website, and that link is going to be in the chat here shortly. So thank you guys so much. Michelle, you want to say a few words?
Thanks for hanging in with us on the audio issues today. And Chris, thanks again for our May presentation.
All right. And with that, I'm going to stop the live stream and stop the record.